Hello and good afternoon. My name is C3F0 and I'm here to give a view from a synthesis made of the grandmother's test by Professor Levi Obonyo and African ethics and journalism ethics by Thaddeus Metz. And both of these articles, from my understanding and from my view, is generally looking into the value of African ethics in journalism. And I will start by the Obonyo's synthesis, which brings out the grandmother's test. And one of the things that I picked from Professor Obonyo's synthesis of the grandmother's test is a talk of African ethical values and moral beliefs that look into relationality and look into keeping, or rather valuing, our moral ethics as Africans. And that is why he brings on the grandmother's test. Why the grandmother? And I would ask, what would the grandmother do, or what would a mother do in the Thaddeus explanation of African ethics and journalism ethics? Because both of them would, in the explanation, talk about a mother and would talk about the African ethics. So Professor Obonyo looks into the role of an elderly person in the society, and this clicks direct onto what are the innate values that journalists ought to carry on from their training and from an Afrocentric view through the use of a grandmother. A grandmother is somebody that keeps the values, somebody who is an elderly and knows and keeps the values of the community. And in the Eurocentric approach, or rather in the Western culture, the elderly people are sent to caregivers' homes, while in the African community, they are seen as a value and they are seen as an inspiration to the younger generation, and they are always looked up to for advice, for reference, for information that is not known by the current generation. So that talks into journalism, where we are supposed to keep a certain moral code of ethic and moral code of conduct. Unfortunately, in some countries like Kenya, journalists are given a moral code of ethic where it shows that it is not innate in them to practice the moral code of journalism. So Professor Obonyo clearly uses the grandmother's test to show, or to rather drive in, the importance of African ethics. And in as much as we are appreciating evolution of journalism, we ought to keep a certain moral code of conduct in continuity of evolution, while keeping that code for the posterity of the community. What is journalism, or what does journalism give to the community? Community is an audience of these journalists, media houses, and journalism in its role, where they are an audience or they are a consumer of what journalists report. So therefore, there ought to be a certain code of conduct. There is a certain way in which journalists are not viewed as a handmaiden of a certain elite or a certain class of people. So the grandmother's test, as explained by Obonyo, is clearly trying to say that the grandmother, like he gives an example, is somebody that would be seen wearing a long dress all the time, keeping short hair, keeping a certain code of conduct, and maintaining a certain way of life. So that is supposed to indirectly communicate that journalism should also have a certain way that is continually or is always known for and is seen to be acting in a certain manner. Unfortunately, African journalists have been trained or have captured the Eurocentric way of behavior. And in as much as the Western journalists or the Western world journalists keep and are very strict to a certain code of conduct, the African journalism has lost it, because we have seen and have even seen the Media Council calling off and suspending journalists because of taking sides or trying to spin a certain narrative of a certain elite. So we are not really keeping into that. While Met, in his own side, tries to talk about African ethics and African journalism from the light of the Ubuntu, where Ubuntu clearly talks about I am because you are. Talks Ubuntu as explained or as written by Dr. Chima Kunam, who I really appreciate, but unfortunately, he only leaves the Ubuntu, he leaves the personhood, he leaves the Ukama, he leaves the Ebub values of the African ethics from a descriptive stage, and he does not give a prescription of how we should continue this. So Thaddeus Metz goes ahead to give an example in his analysis of the Kantism and the utilitarian theory, where it gives an example of a mother again, a mother who is a keeper of life, as said or explained by Professor Obonyo, and a doctor, where a doctor is seen to be a community utility. And in the utilitarian theory, a doctor ought to be saved in a situation where my mother drowns and a doctor drowns. The utilitarian or the Kantism teaches me, or rather would drive me to save the doctor for the sake of the community. But the Ubuntu or the personhood or the African ethic driven by the Ubuntu light would want me to behave in a rational way, where my mother has brought me up or my grandmother has taken care of me, and it is my responsibility therefore to save my grandmother or my mother rather than saving the doctor, whom I don't know, whom I do not relate with. So he speaks into that, and also goes ahead to boldly talk about these the values that the Ubuntu, the Ubuntuism is driving, or rather should be practiced more in the African context and in the Afrocentric journalistic ethical behavior, that we should treat everybody, or rather all the humans, in a humane manner and not in a gracism or a certain way of hierarchical way of power or treating others in their status, but treating everybody as a community so that we all benefit from what the African journalism ought to be. Thank you so much, and I hope my analysis has been